The mail drops through the slot and lands at my feet with a sound that feels too loud in my quiet apartment. I stare at the envelope on the floor for a long moment before bending to pick it up. Court seal, official letterhead. My hands start shaking before I even open it because I know what this is. I know who this is from. My name is Maribel Thorne Wexler and I live in Columbus, Ohio. And after 6 years of complete silence, my ex-husband has finally acknowledged our child's existence. Not with an apology or a phone call or even a text message, but with a legal document that I'm holding with trembling fingers. I sit down on my couch because my legs feel weak and I open the envelope carefully like it might explode, and in a way it does. The words blur together at first, but certain phrases jump out. Motion to terminate future claims, establishment of paternity, court-ordered DNA testing. And I realize what's happening. He's not reaching out to be a father. He's not trying to make things right. He's trying to legally erase any possibility that he might owe us something, trying to officially document that my son, our son, doesn't exist to him. And the audacity of it after all these years makes me feel something between rage and exhausted resignation. I need you to understand who I am before I tell you the rest of this story. My name is Maribel Thorne Wexler. I'm 34 years old. I work as a financial analyst for a healthcare company. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus with my 6-year-old son, and I never planned to raise a child alone. Never imagined I'd be the kind of woman who filled out school forms with one parent's name, who attended parent-teacher conferences solo, who made every decision about another human. Being without a partner to consult, I'm not a victim and I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who got pregnant in what I thought was a stable marriage and then watched that marriage implode the moment I announced the pregnancy. I'm someone who spent 6 years building a life for my son while his father pretended we didn't exist. And now I'm someone holding a legal document that might finally force the truth into the open. Might finally make him acknowledge what he's denied for so long, that the child he walked away from is his. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it was ordinary. We met in our 20s, got married at 28, settled into a small house in the suburbs. We both worked full-time, him as a sales manager, me in finance. We had routines, weekend brunches, and Netflix binges and arguments about whose turn it was to do laundry. We talked about having kids someday, talked about buying a bigger house, talked about all the future plans that couples make when they think they have time. There were no red flags I could see, no warning signs that he was capable of what he did. Sure, we had our problems. Every couple does. He traveled for work sometimes. I worked long hours. We weren't always great at communicating, but nothing that felt catastrophic. Nothing that prepared me for how quickly everything would fall apart. I thought we were stable, thought we were building something, thought that when I got pregnant it would be a celebration. But I was wrong about all of it. Wrong about him, wrong about us, wrong about what happens when stability meets the unexpected. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday morning, 3 tests just to be sure, and I was terrified but also excited. We'd talked about kids, said we'd start trying soon. This was just a little earlier than planned. I told him that night over dinner, tried to make it special, tried to present it as good news. And for maybe 30 seconds he smiled, said wow, said this is big. But then something shifted in his face and the questions started. When did this happen? He asked. And I explained the timeline, explained when I must have conceived, and he got quiet. I was traveling that week, he said, and I reminded him he'd been home for the weekend. We'd had that whole Saturday together, but he just kept calculating, kept questioning. Are you sure about the dates? Could it have been earlier? Were you seeing anyone while I was gone? And that last question, that accusation disguised as curiosity, it hit me like cold water. What are you asking? I said. And he looked at me with doubt I'd never seen before. I'm just trying to understand the timeline, he said, but what he meant was clear. He was trying to understand if this baby was his. The accusation came a week later, after days of tense silence and him doing math I couldn't follow, calculating days and dates like he was trying to solve a problem instead of processing news about our future. We were in our bedroom. I was getting ready for another doctor's appointment he'd said he was too busy to attend, and he just said it, calm and professional like he was presenting data at a work meeting. I don't think the baby is mine, and I remember freezing with my hand on the closet door, remember turning to look at him and seeing no emotion on his face, just cold certainty. What did you say? I asked, needing him to repeat it, needing to make sure I'd heard correctly. And he did. He repeated it, explained his reasoning, the timing of his business trips, the days I'd ovulated according to his calculations, the fact that I'd seemed distant lately. And I listened to him build a case against me based on nothing, based on paranoia and maybe guilt about something he was doing. And I felt something inside me detach, something fundamental about who we were to each other just broke. You think I cheated on you? I said, and he shrugged. I think we should be sure. And I understood then that no amount of explanation would convince him. He'd decided I was lying, and that was that. He refused everything after that, refused to sign the birth certificate when I asked him to start thinking about names, refused to come to prenatal appointments even though I begged him to see the ultrasound, to hear the heartbeat, to understand this was real, refused to stay married to a woman carrying a child he claimed wasn't his. I can't do this, he said one night. I can't pretend everything is fine when I have these doubts. And I tried to reason with him, tried to suggest we do a paternity test after the baby was born if he was so convinced, tried to make him see how his accusations were destroying us, but he was already gone emotionally, already planning his exit. I'd watch him pack his work bag in the morning and wonder if this would be the day he didn't come home, and then one day it was. I came home from work to find half his stuff missing. A note on the kitchen counter that said he needed space, that he'd been thinking about everything and couldn't continue in a marriage where he didn't trust me, that he'd filed for divorce and I should expect papers soon, and that was it. No conversation, no chance to defend myself, just abandonment while I was 4 months pregnant. The divorce moved faster than I expected. He hired a lawyer who was efficient and cold. My lawyer kept asking about child support and custody, and I kept saying he didn't believe the baby was his, kept explaining that he'd refused to be listed as the father, and she looked at me with this mixture of pity and confusion. He can't just opt out, she said. Biology doesn't work that way. But I was too tired to fight, too overwhelmed by being pregnant and losing my marriage and trying to keep my job. I just wanted it over, wanted him gone, wanted to stop hearing his accusations, so we agreed to terms that didn't mention the baby, didn't include support or custody or acknowledgement. We split our assets, sold the house, divided our savings, and never once did the divorce papers reference the fact that I was visibly pregnant. It was like the pregnancy didn't exist legally, like we were erasing it from our history, and maybe that's what he wanted, a clean break that pretended the baby wasn't real, and I let him have it because fighting felt impossible. I delivered alone on a cold February morning. My mom had offered to come, but she lived 3 states away, and I'd told her I was fine. Told her I had friends who'd be there, but when the contractions started at midnight I drove myself to the hospital and labored without a single person in the room. Nurses came and went, checked monitors, asked questions I answered between contractions, but there was no hand to hold. No one to tell me I was doing great, just me and medical staff and the overwhelming reality of bringing a human into the world with no partner to share it. When they finally placed my son on my chest I cried, not happy tears exactly, but something more complicated, relief and sadness and love and grief all mixed together. And when the nurse brought the birth certificate paperwork and asked about the father I hesitated, stared at that blank line for a long time, and then I filled in his name. His full legal name, even though he wasn't there, even though He denied this child, even though I knew it might cause problems, because it was true and truth mattered even when it was ignored. Every milestone came with a reminder of what was missing. My son's first smile looked exactly like his father's, the same lopsided grin, the same way his eyes crinkled, and I'd look at him and feel this ache, this evidence that my ex-husband had denied. When my son started walking and everyone commented on how he looked just like me, I wanted to tell them no, he has his father's walk, his father's hands, his father's expressions. But I didn't. I just smiled and thanked them. Every birthday, every holiday, every school event where other kids had two parents and mine had one, it all felt heavier because I knew the truth, knew that somewhere my ex was living his life pretending this child didn't exist, pretending he hadn't abandoned his own son based on paranoia and accusations he'd never proven. And my son would ask sometimes, "Where's my daddy?" And I'd say something vague about him living far away, about how sometimes families look different, but inside I was carrying this weight of knowing that his father had chosen denial over responsibility, had chosen comfort over truth, and there was nothing I could do about it. I didn't file for paternity right away, and people judged me for that. Friends would ask why I wasn't pursuing child support. Family would suggest I take legal action, but they didn't understand how expensive legal battles are, didn't understand that I was barely keeping my head above water financially, that daycare and rent and baby supplies were consuming every dollar I made, that hiring a lawyer to force paternity testing felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, and beyond the money there was the emotional cost, the idea of spending months or years fighting someone who'd already made clear he wanted nothing to do with us, the fear that even if I won, even if the test proved he was the father, it wouldn't change anything. He'd still be the man who abandoned his pregnant wife, still be the father who denied his own child. So I chose survival over vindication, chose peace over paperwork, chose to focus on raising my son instead of fighting his father. And maybe that was the wrong choice. Maybe I should have forced the issue immediately, but I was just trying to survive each day, trying to be Ugg for both of us. Time passed in that way it does when you're drowning in responsibility. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. My son grew from an infant to a toddler to a little boy who played soccer and asked constant questions and had opinions about everything. I rebuilt my career slowly, working my way back up after maternity leave, proving I could be reliable despite being a single parent. We developed routines. Just the two of us, Saturday morning pancakes and bedtime stories and inside jokes. We lived quietly in Columbus, in a city where nobody knew our history, where people just assumed I was divorced and his father was somewhere else. And I let them assume because explaining was exhausting. I assumed the truth would stay buried, assumed my ex had moved on with his life and would never look back, assumed that whatever guilt or curiosity he might feel would never be enough to make him act. And for 6 years I was right. For 6 years there was nothing but silence. And then the envelope came. The legal notice explained that my ex had filed a motion. He wanted the court to officially establish that he was not the father of my child, wanted it documented legally so that no future claims could be made against him, wanted protection from any possibility that I might come after him for support or acknowledgement. And reading it I felt something I hadn't expected, not anger exactly but clarity. He'd spent 6 years free, 6 years living whatever life he'd built, and now he wanted to make sure that freedom was permanent, wanted to close the door officially on any responsibility. But what he didn't realize, what his lawyer apparently hadn't explained, was that you can't file a motion to establish non-paternity when your name is on the birth certificate. You can't legally deny a child who's already legally yours. And by bringing this to court, by trying to protect himself, he'd actually opened the door to the one thing he'd been avoiding, proof. The court responded to his motion with a counter-motion. If he wanted to establish paternity status, then DNA testing would be required. There would be no assumptions, no accusations, just biology, and suddenly the truth he'd been avoiding was inevitable. The court ordered DNA testing and there was no arguing with it, no delays, no way to avoid it. My ex tried apparently. His lawyer filed motions claiming harassment, claiming this was just my attempt to extort money, claiming all sorts of things that didn't matter because the judge was clear. If paternity is in question, then testing is mandatory. They scheduled it at a clinic downtown. Separate appointments so we wouldn't have to see each other. They swabbed my son's cheek and then days later they swabbed his father's cheek, and then we waited. 2 weeks that felt like forever. 2 weeks where I alternated between certainty and doubt. I knew he was the father. I'd never been with anyone else, never even looked at another man, but 6 years of accusations had planted some seed of fear, some tiny voice that whispered, what if somehow I was wrong? What if there was some medical impossibility I didn't understand? What if the test came back negative and every terrible thing he'd said about me turned out to be prophetic? But then the results came and all that fear evaporated. 99.99% probability of paternity, the highest certainty science can offer. And the paper I held in my hands was proof, undeniable biological proof, that I'd been telling the truth all along. The room went silent when those results were read in court. I was there with my lawyer, he was there with his. The judge read the findings aloud. The test establishes with 99.99% certainty that the defendant is the biological father. And I watched my ex's face drain of color, watched him look at his lawyer like there must be some mistake, watched the certainty he'd carried for 6 years crumble in one official document. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he just kept shaking his head, kept staring at the paper like if he looked long enough it would change. And I felt nothing, no vindication, no satisfaction, just exhaustion, because what did this change really? It didn't give my son his father, didn't erase 6 years of absence, didn't undo the damage of growing up believing your father didn't want you. All it did was prove what I'd always known, that I'd been telling the truth, that he'd been wrong, that his accusations had destroyed our family based on nothing but paranoia and distrust, and now we all had to live with that. The court established paternity officially, added his name to the corrected birth certificate, ordered retroactive child support for the entire 6 years he'd been absent, calculated with interest, ordered ongoing monthly payments, established legal responsibility whether he wanted it or not, and I watched it all happen from across the courtroom. Watched him realize that his attempt to protect himself had backtracked spectacularly, that by bringing this to court he'd actually triggered the exact consequences he'd been trying to avoid. His lawyer tried to argue the amounts, tried to claim financial hardship, tried to negotiate lower payments, but the judge wasn't sympathetic. You had 6 years to take responsibility voluntarily, she said. The court sees no reason for leniency, and she signed the orders right there, made them official, made them enforceable, and suddenly my ex wasn't free anymore, wasn't living some consequence-free life. He was legally bound to the child he denied, financially responsible for the years he'd been absent, and as much as I'd thought I'd feel victorious in this moment, all I felt was tired, tired of fighting, tired of proving, tired of this whole situation that should never have happened. He asked for visitation rights after the paternity was established, and I didn't know how to feel about that. His lawyer filed the paperwork requesting a custody schedule, requesting time with the son he denied for 6 years, and my lawyer asked what I wanted, asked if I was willing to let him into our lives now after everything, and I didn't know. Part of me wanted to protect my son from this stranger who'd call himself father, wanted to shield him from the inevitable confusion and hurt, but another part knew that legally he had rights now, and maybe beyond that. My son deserved the chance to know his father even if his father didn't deserve to know him. so we started slowly, supervised visits at first, an hour at a time at a neutral location, and I watched through observation windows as my ex tried to talk to a 6-year-old he'd never met, watched him be awkward and uncertain, watched my son be polite but distant because why wouldn't he be? This man was a stranger. Biology didn't make them family, love and presence made them family, and those things didn't exist yet, might never exist, and every visit I wondered if this was helping or hurting, if knowing a reluctant father was better than having no father at all. My son was old enough to ask questions now and I couldn't avoid them anymore. Why wasn't he around before? He asked one night after a visit, and I had to choose between protecting his father's reputation or telling him age-appropriate truth. He made a mistake, I said carefully. He wasn't sure you were his son and he should have been, and my son processed that. But I am his son, he said, and I nodded. Yes, baby, you are. And now everyone knows that, but he kept pushing. Why didn't he know before? And I didn't know how to explain adult failures to a child. Didn't know how to say your father didn't trust me, didn't believe in us, chose doubt over love, so I just said, sometimes grown-ups make bad choices and kids get hurt and it's not fair, but it's not your fault, and he seemed to accept that, seemed to understand that this situation was complicated beyond his comprehension, and I was grateful he didn't push further, but I knew eventually he would. Eventually he'd want the full story, and I'd have to decide how honest to be about the man who denied his existence. The consequences extended beyond money and custody. My ex's reputation took hits he hadn't anticipated. People in his life found out what had happened, co-workers, family, friends. They learned that he'd abandoned his pregnant wife, that he'd denied his son for 6 years, that he'd only acknowledged paternity when forced by court order. And small-town judgment is real even in cities. People talked. People formed opinions. His family reached out to me apologizing for not knowing, for not helping, for believing his version of events. His mother cried on the phone saying she'd missed her grandson's entire early childhood because her son had lied. And I felt bad for her but also resentful, because where had she been? Where had any of them been when I was struggling alone, suffering through accusations with no support, and his workplace became uncomfortable apparently? People looked at him differently once they knew, questioned his character, questioned how someone could deny their own child, and the protective denial that had served him for 6 years suddenly became the thing destroying his reputation, and I didn't feel good about that exactly, didn't take pleasure in his suffering, but I also couldn't pretend he didn't deserve consequences for his choices. I didn't feel victorious when everything was finally settled. I felt finished. The truth had done its job, had established reality, had created legal accountability, had proven what I'd known all along, but it hadn't healed anything, hadn't restored what was lost, hadn't given my son the father he deserved. It had just corrected the record and forced responsibility. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all I could hope for. I looked at the court documents, the amended birth certificate, the child support orders, the custody agreement, and I felt closure but not celebration, felt like a chapter had ended but the book was still being written. My son was 6 years old now, growing up in a life that included his father peripherally but not centrally, learning to navigate a relationship with someone who was biologically connected but emotionally distant. And I was learning to let that relationship develop without my interference, without my resentment shaping it, trying to give my son the space to form his own opinions about his father based on who that man was now, not who he'd been. And it was hard, harder than I expected, but necessary. If someone denies responsibility long enough, does justice still count when it finally arrives? I think about that question a lot. Think about whether forcing acknowledgement after 6 years means anything, whether court-ordered support and legally mandated visitation equal real fatherhood, whether truth arriving late is still truth worth having, and I don't have clear answers. What I know is this: I spent 6 years being called a liar. 6 years raising a child alone while his father lived free. 6 years wondering if I should have fought harder or earlier or differently. And then one envelope changed everything, proved what I'd always known, made him face what he'd been avoiding. And now my son has a father on paper, has financial support, has legal acknowledgement, but he still doesn't have what he really needed: a father who showed up willingly, who believed in him from the start, who chose responsibility over denial. And I wonder if you've been here too, if you've waited for someone to acknowledge truth they were running from, if you've chosen patience over fighting, survival over vindication. And I want to know, would you have done it differently? Would you have forced paternity testing immediately, or would you have done what I did and just tried to survive? And if someone came back years later, if the truth finally emerged but only because they were forced to face it, would you call that justice or just biology correcting itself? Tell me in the comments what you would do. Tell me if my choices make sense or if I should have fought harder from the start. Tell me about the times you were accused of lying when you were telling the truth. About the times someone denied reality until they couldn't anymore. Share your story, because maybe it will help someone else who's facing this choice right now. Someone who's pregnant and alone. Someone who's being accused. Someone who's wondering if fighting for truth is worth the cost. And maybe together we can figure out if waiting for justice is strength or if demanding it immediately is braver. So comment below, tell me what you think, tell me your story, because this isn't just my story. It's every parent who's been denied, every truth that's been questioned, every child who's grown up with one parent because the other chose doubt over love. And your voice matters, your experience matters, so share it. Engage with this. Let's talk about what happens when truth takes years to arrive, and whether that arrival counts as victory or just inevitable correction.